Chapter 4. Roy Ackerman. The next morning, when Eric woke up, he was confused. His first thought was, am I a boy or a dog? His second was, what made me think of that? Then he looked at his hands. They were as dirty as he had ever seen them, but they were hands. His mum entered the room and drew the curtains. Come on, Eric, sun's shining. Mum, I want to tell you something. Yes, said his mum, and then she left the room. Eric heard her on the landing talking to Emily. He raised his voice. Did you see a dog in the house last night? Yes. Did it wake you? Mrs. Banks came in again, carrying his clean shirt and socks, and followed by Emily. Emily had a dressing gown on and a thumb in her mouth. Mum, said Eric, I want you to tell me something. I saw a dog, said Emily. I want one. Mrs. Banks put Eric's clean clothes on the chair and picked up the dirty ones. Eric got out of bed. You know that dog? Well, I want one, said Emily. Mrs. Banks gazed around the room as though she had forgotten something. Then she looked at Eric. Then she stared at him. Mum, you see, that dog... Eric, look at your face. Didn't you wash last night? Well, let me see your hands. Reluctantly, Eric held them out. About this dog. I want one, said Emily. Then Mrs. Banks saw Eric's hands. She was horrified. It wasn't like him to go to bed in that condition. Eric wanted to say that the reason his hands were dirty was that last night there'd been paws and that he'd been running around the streets on them. But somehow he couldn't get the words out. He thought of revealing his feet. They'd be as bad and ought to prove something, but he couldn't bring himself to do that either. Instead, he accepted the telling off. When his mum sent him to the bathroom, he managed to keep his feet out of sight. After that, he got dressed, had his breakfast, and went off on his cousin Marion's paper round. Maybe he could tell his mum when he returned. In any case, one thing was for sure, he could tell Roy. Eric collected his papers at the newsagent's. He had been doing the round for nearly 3 weeks now, ever since Marion had broken her arm. He had hoped to be doing it for a while yet. Marion was ready to return, but her mum said it was too soon. He set off up the road, as usual. Roy was waiting for him at the corner of Freeth Street. Roy never went to the shop. Mr. Sturgis, he was the newsagent, didn't like paper rounds to be shared. Roy Ackerman was taller than Eric, frecklier too. His hair was gingerish and wiry. It wouldn't lie flat, not even after swimming. On most occasions, he wore a sort of jockey cap. Roy was an excitable boy, the kind of boy who rarely stopped talking in class unless the teacher asked him a question. Mrs. Jessup said he was a bad influence on Eric. Roy's mother blamed the school. She said Eric was a bad influence on him. Eric and Roy had known each other since play school. They had been friends since the infant school. In Mrs. Jessup's class, they sat at a table near the front. Eric sat there so there'd be no one could see the marker board. He was a bit short-sighted. Roy sat there so that Mrs. Jessup could see him. I've got something to tell you, Roy, said Eric. You won't believe it, though. I'll believe it, said Roy. No, you won't. Yes, I will. You won't, said Roy. I will. I'll believe anything. Right, said Eric. Last night I turned into a dog. Roy paused. He was pushing a Radio Times through the letterbox. Well, nearly anything, he said. And then, what sort of dog? A Norfolk Terrier, said Eric. Then I went downstairs and Dad thought I was a real dog, and he put me out. It was 10:30 before I got back in, and then I changed into a boy again. For a moment, Roy and Eric separated to deliver the papers on opposite sides of the road. Then Eric continued, When I woke up, my hands and feet were black from running around the streets. You can ask my mum. She saw them. And Emily, I chased the cat. Roy listened closely to what Eric was saying and watched his face whenever he got the chance. Eric never pulled his leg before. He wasn't that kind of boy. Roy had always admired Eric ever since the infants. He was the one who worked things out. The one who usually made them up was him, Roy. All the same, turning into a dog, that took some believing, and Roy began to make an effort to believe it. Did you catch the cat? He said. Other questions that Roy asked during the paper round were, what did it feel like? Plus 3 or 4 versions of, were you scared? When they delivered the papers in Stone Street, they encountered a bull mastiff again. It was chained up at the back of number 16. It barked and leapt against the side gate. Its chain rattled. Eric described his meetings with the dog the night before. What did you do? Said Roy. And Eric said, well, barked at it. In Vicarage Road, they met Eric's dad. He was out on his round. As usual, the 2 boys stopped to say hello. Mr. Banks had a quick look at the sports page in one of the papers and gave them each a mint imperial. Afterwards, Roy said, how about your dad? Does he know? Nobody knows, said Eric. Just me and you. Didn't you tell your mum? Eric shook his head. I was going to, but I couldn't. I wouldn't tell mine, said Roy. She'd say I was making it up. He pulled his jockey cap over his eyes. So it's a secret, just me and you. Well, yes, said Eric. And Roy, who was perhaps now beginning to believe, or half believe it, said, brilliant. From then on, there was little time for talking. They were behind with the round, and it was late. As soon as they had finished, Eric raced home for his second breakfast. Roy also went home. He said he had called for Eric in about 10 minutes. When Eric came into the kitchen, he found his mum drinking a cup of tea, and his sister was chalking a picture on a blackboard and sneaking a cornflake once in a while from Eric's bowl, where they were poured out ready. Eric sat down, added milk and sugar, and began to eat. His mum drank her tea and watched him. You're a bit late. Yes, said Eric. What was it you wanted to tell me? What? Asked Eric. He heard well enough, but was playing for time. Suddenly, he knew he wasn't going to tell his mum. Well, not yet, anyway. What did you want to tell me? Said his mum. I can't remember. Eric bent over his bowl. He could feel his mum's gaze on the back of his neck. She had a way of finding things out that was a permanent mystery for him. Mrs. Banks carried a cup to the sink and glanced out of the window. Are you all right, Eric? Yes, said Eric. He turned his attention to Emily. She was crouching at the blackboard with her back to him. What are you drawing? A dog, said Emily, without looking around. And his mum said she wants one. Eric finished his breakfast and found the things he needed for school. His plimsolls, a bag of cabbage stalks for the student's rabbit, and his school camp money. This was in an envelope on the table. After that, Roy arrived. He drew a hat on Emily's dog, which he thought was very funny. Eric gave him a look and a nudge. The look said, I haven't told my mum, and she thinks we're up to something. Eric could see his mum was watching Roy. The nudge said, let go. On the way to school, Roy asked more questions. He'd had time to think, although he never said it in so many words. What was he looking for now was proof. Eric realised this and did what he could. In an odd way, he was looking for proof too. I told you writing in the dirt, didn't I? They were approaching the front playground. Yes, said Roy, so we could ask that woman. You mean you could ask her? Eric said. They entered the playground. And I told you about begging for chips. Roy laughed. Begging for chips? He loved that, whether it was true or not. Ahead of them, a pile of boys was struggling on the ground. Perched on top was a familiar figure, looking pleased with himself. It was Hopper. Eric and Roy stared at each other. Roy said, Didn't you say? Yes, Eric, it was Hopper. It was Hopper. I got the chips off. That's proof. Ask him. Right, said Roy, then hesitated. The trouble was, asking Hopper was easier said than done. Hopper was unpredictable. He could get a gang onto you for looking at him, for not looking at him, even. Hopper was a solid boy. He had a square body and a square head. He never wore a coat, even when it snowed. He had transfers of famous racing cars stuck to his arms and tattoos in blue felt pen on the back of his hands. Roy took his jockey cap off and put it on again. You ask him, he said. I don't need to ask him, said Eric. I was there. You ask him. A red ball came bouncing towards them, followed by a pack of first-year boys. Roy kicked the ball back, over the heads. I've got it, he said. Let's get Kenny Biggs to ask them. Kenny was Hopper's cousin. Also, he was in Roy and Eric's class. So Kenny was approached, told as little as was necessary, and promised a handful of Eric's crisps at playtime for his trouble, and he agreed to do the job. Ask him. Was he at Purnell's fish shop last night? Said Eric. And was a dog there? Said Roy. And what happened? Eric said. Kenny went off in search of Hopper. He had left a pile of boys he'd been sitting on and gone into the back playground. Eric and Roy sat on the dustbins outside the caretaker's room. The red ball came bouncing towards them again. This time Eric took a kick at it. The pursuing first years yelled in protest, turned and followed the ball. Then Kenny came back. What did he say? Said Eric and Roy together. Hopper says, Who wants to know? Said Kenny Briggs. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And don't forget that reading can be magical if you give it a chance. I'll see you again soon.